So, object theatre is a form that I've seen when I've been at festivals across the world, different international theatre festivals. And I was given the greatest of delight to work for a week's development workshop with Agnes Limbos from Gare Centrale, this wonderful Flemish company. That is what they have dedicated their life's work to, is to object theatre. And object theatre basically uses objects like these to help you drive the narrative or story forward. There is text, there can be music, but ultimately the objects are the key characters almost of the story. And so when you're making a work that's object theatre driven, you spend a lot of time having to select, to audition the objects and try to figure out if those objects are really telling you the story that you want to have told. So if, for example, if we were to be telling a story about, I don't know, a futuristic air battle between spaceships, and I use an object like this to tell that story, you would go, oh, that's weird, because that's an aeroplane, not a spaceship. But if I was to tell you the story of a 1930s fighter plane battle and use that object, then that would make some sense. That's a really simple example. Another example might be if I were to introduce you to a character in this play, in this story, and say, she's my granny, and I love my granny. And my granny is represented through a teacup. And when you see the story and hear granny being mentioned, I say, here's granny, and I present her, and it's a teacup. Immediately you will start to make other associations because it's a teacup and what granny is like. So granny probably likes tea. If it's a nice posh porcelain cup compared to a regular stoneware cup, that will also tell you something about granny. And so you start to fill in a lot of the gaps because of the object that's been used. Of course, you could potentially present a bottle of whiskey as granny, and that will tell us a very different story. But you will make those connections for yourself. And so we spend a lot of time auditioning these objects while also trying to figure out how to bring the story to life through those objects. While we've been making up, what started off was an idea that I had. And weirdly, when I first started to explore this, it was years ago, and I worked with a company who specialised in circus. Because of where the story is set, I thought it'd be useful having air-based art forms, so Chinese pole or ropes or swings, things like that. As we workshopped it back then, I realised that this story that we're trying to tell doesn't fit this form. And then when I took part in these workshops with Agnes Limbos, I saw that this form really helped to tell the story. So once I'd discovered that form, I then had a conversation with the wonderful Frances Poet, and Frances is a fabulous writer. I talked to her about the idea that I had as a story, and then she gave us a whole pile of different bits of material for backstory for what was important to the story we're telling, which then gave us this material which to improvise and play with. Some of those elements of her story work really well, other things we've had to kind of deviate or move into slightly different directions, but it's always the objects that have told us which way to go. Now, so we have that starting point, and of course that makes you go, okay, what objects might help liberate this story for us? And as you're playing, you start to discover that some objects really help and some don't. So that means you then have to go, okay, well, I go and get some other objects and see where we get them. So we spend a lot of our time in charity shops. Our team go out getting a lot of reused or recycled goods to kind of go, how does that work? How does that work? And of course, we all have these objects in our houses, loads of different objects, and they're so emotional to us in so many ways. So when we bring them into the story, they start to have this emotional connection, not only for the artists who are making the work, but also for the audience as they make those connections. So when we were doing the development workshops, first of all, when we did the first sharing with the Manipulate Festival a few years back, the two actors I'm working with, the wonderful Zoe Hunter and Mark McCormick, Zoe has done a lot of puppetry and also some object theatre before. Martin had never done object theatre. And so we spent the first few days exploring the language and the rules and how this form could work. So it's just a lot of improvisation out with the story that we're trying to tell as we understood how these objects work and how you present them in a way that becomes meaningful or fun or adds in emotional context or substance to things. So once we'd all got on the same page with the vocabulary, that then allowed us to then start going, okay, now we know some of the rules, some of our understanding that we've shared together and learned together, we can now start to dig in the story idea that we had and try to figure out how this works with that.